Welcome, and thanks for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. While critiques of modern market economics are a dime a dozen, the solutions always seem to go down the road of more top-down government involvement. Our guest today has a series of alternative ideas. He's authored, along with Eric Posner, a book called Radical Markets, Uprooting Capitalism and Democracy for a Just Society. Thank you, Glen Weyl, for being with us today.
My pleasure, Tony.
So I guess the first question, what's the basic premise of the book?
The idea of the book is that we've had lots of complaints about inequality, but also about stagnating economies. And, the usual solutions, as you put it, kind of fall short. They don't live up to our values of liberty. They don't live up to the promise of actually creating shared prosperity for everyone. And so what we propose is instead radically reimagining how we can use markets to actually achieve these egalitarian goals, while at the same time accelerating the pace of economic development by having new ways of voting that use market mechanisms and new ways of property ownership, or you could call it wealth taxation, that unlike usual forms that sort of reduce investment would actually accelerate entrepreneurship.
I'm going to get to each of those topics. Don't worry about that. But maybe tell me a little bit about what inspired you to write this book. You said that you looked around and it was sort of all these common prescriptions. Is that what did it for you? You wanted to see something else out there as possible solutions?
Well, I was an economist at the University of Chicago for a number of years, where I met my co-author, Eric Posner. And University of Chicago is famous market-oriented place. We did a lot of work on saying, okay, if I want to take those ideas seriously, take them to the next level, what do they imply? Came up with a lot of sort of creative ideas like these. And it was really hard within the field of economics to get people to take seriously fundamental innovation like that. People wanted to study how things are. They wanted to look around the edges. They didn't want to reimagine things. And when politics in 2016 started getting very polarized, we thought that it was time to try to bring this to a broader audience and see where it would resonate. And that's why we ended up deciding to write the book. And really interestingly, we never anticipated it. It's really been the blockchain space and the Web3 space that's taken up these ideas, because they're really interested in this notion of like fundamentally thinking about new economic and political systems.
So that's interesting. So it wasn't really doing a traditional book tour. It kind of went viral via blockchain and 3.0 web, that kind of thing.
Well, I tried to do a traditional book tour, and it was fine. But where it really took off was in that community, and that's really what led to this organization I founded, RadicalxChange, getting started. And it was actually in Canada. I came to Toronto for a conference that Vitalik Buterin, your Steve Jobs up there, I guess, held, and we've been working together very closely ever since.
So what needs to change in the way that markets are ordered?
Well, let's talk first of all about not quite what you would think of as markets, but let's see how they apply, which is voting. So the usual way that we vote is every person gets one vote on a candidate, an issue, et cetera, which doesn't really give you a lot of freedom, right? In a marketplace, you don't just get one ration of food or one ration of cars or whatever. You get to choose what's important to you. And we don't have that really in the political world. You just, you get one vote regardless of how important something is, regardless of how you feel about the things. And you express it usually on like one candidate. You don't say, this candidate's okay, this candidate's great, this initiative's okay by me. And what that means is that all the difficult decisions, all the compromises happen in a super centralized way among bureaucrats, among politicians. What if we instead could empower people themselves to express themselves as richly as they do in the marketplace, but in the political arena? And that's what quadratic voting does. It's a market-based mechanism for making decisions collectively that's now being used in Taiwan, in Colorado, we're in Brazil, we're using it actually all over the world. We've discussed using it with the conservatives in Canada as well. So we'd be delighted to tell you more about it, but that's the basic idea.
We are going to talk more about it, but we are going to take a little bit of a break so that we don't disrupt the conversation too much. Please stay with us. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Glen Weyl. He is the founder of RadicalxChange and has also written a book about uprooting capitalism and democracy for a just society called Radical Markets. Glen, we were just sort of unpacking your ideas about kind of creating a hierarchy of voting that is different from just casting one ballot, I guess is the way to put it. So let's dig a little bit deeper into that. It's always tough to get people engaged in democratic exercise. Even to exercise one vote is sometimes very, very difficult because most people, or some people, let's say, well, my vote doesn't count and it really isn't going to matter that much. So how do you get enough people engaged in a kind of a multiple voting scenario, which is what you're suggesting, in order to make this work in a truly democratic way?
Well, I think that, you might think you give people more freedom, you give them more flexibility, it's daunting. But another way to think about it is it's fun, it's engaging, it's like gamifying. And that's what we found. We found when you run surveys with this, you actually get more people completing them, even though it takes them, maybe twice as long to complete it, because it actually engages them in reflecting on the things that matter to them rather than in some stupid choice that they're usually kind of indifferent to. They might think both these candidates are awful. I don't have anything to say about that. But if you give them the freedom to really express themselves more richly, to pull out the candidates that they would really like to see, and then to maybe not express themselves that much about the dominant candidates because maybe they don't care. That's the sort of thing that quadratic voting allows you to do, or it allows you to pull apart individual issues or individual initiatives that you're involved in. Or maybe you are disengaged from national politics, fine. Maybe you can use your votes more on local politics. I am a very transient person. I've lived in many places. I don't know anything about our local elections. I'd love to defer to the locals, to give them more say, and to have more say on, the national or international issues that I know most about. And that's the sort of democracy we want. We want a democracy that leverages specialization, just like we have markets that leverage specialization.
How then does that transpose to some of your ideas about the marketplace and how that works?
Well, let's take it in one step. So now I want to tell you about a new way that this is being used for finance. So in the Ethereum community, where there's all these open source projects that support open source software projects that support the development of the community, they need a way to fund them. And usual markets don't work very well because these open source software projects, there's no way to charge for them. They're basic infrastructure for the whole community. No one's ever really managed to make a good model out of software. And so they need to find a way to give these people a livelihood so they can continue to develop and so the system can prosper. And the way that they've done that is using a variation on quadratic voting called quadratic funding. This is a system where people can make contributions, like on Kickstarter, to a crowdfunding project, but those contributions get matched. And they get matched in sort of a democratic way, which is that smaller contributions get matched more, and contributions to projects with a lot of different people contributing to them get matched more. And so that is sort of a mixture between the principles of sort of democracy and the principles of a market, right? And that's been a really successful way of supporting all sorts of projects within the ecosystem in this Ethereum world, and also in other parts of open source software. And that starts to give us a different way of thinking about how financial markets could work. Imagine, and government, like rather than just having markets on the one side and government on the other, that we had this hybrid where the public sector provided matching funds to allow crowdsourcing to direct funds to the things that the people find most important.
It kind of reminds me back in after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a lot of different solutions. I remember in the Czech Republic, for instance, they wanted to privatize all of these state-run enterprises, and they gave basically people shares that they could invest wherever they wanted to invest in those privatizing former state enterprises. So is that kind of like, it gives people power over their financial investments, which in turn gives them power over their political investments in a way.
So I think that that's definitely the type of spirit of using market mechanisms. I think the thing that's different here is that we're trying to design market mechanisms to serve purposes that markets traditionally haven't served, like generating common goods for the public rather than just generating profit. And another example, like what you were describing, is in Hungary around the same time, there was a professor who started
We're gonna take a little break. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Glen Weyl. He's the founder of RadicalxChange. Glen, I had to cut you off there, but talking a little bit about the example of Hungary and how they were reallocating resources. Please continue.
Yeah, so there's a prominent economist there named Tibor Liska, and he had this idea of how you could create a property system that was both more communal and egalitarian, but also more like market friendly than even capitalist systems were. And it turns out this had been invented by a University of Chicago economist a number of years back and had been used in ancient Greece and different places. But the way he did it was that people had assets like, houses or cars or a factory, and they were charged a wealth tax on this asset. Now, the basis for that wealth tax was a price they chose themselves. So they set the price on which the wealth tax was charged, but they had to be willing to sell it to any other member of the community at that price. And then the tax went back to fund these public projects. Let's say it could be in the world that I was describing it, like these matching funds for us to build common infrastructure. So the idea is that actually you make the market work better, because people right now might sit on an asset, even if it's not productive, they might monopolize it. Whereas in this world, actually, they're forced to turn it over to people who can use it better. And that makes the whole economy more dynamic, a more complete market economy, and at the same time as collecting all this tax revenue that can be used to make things more equal and build common goods.
Are you concerned about any arbitrage possibilities, like somebody gaming the system somehow?
Well, the thing that is interesting about this system is that it really makes that very hard to pull off, because if you raise the price on an asset, well, now you're going to pay a higher tax on it. And the only way for you to make an arbitrage profit is for someone else to buy it at that price. So you try to raise it to a high price, no one buys it, and you end up paying this tax on it. So it's a system that's sort of deliberately designed to undermine the speculative tendencies that keep assets sort of sitting around in a lot of markets.
When you're researching all of this, this sounds a lot like you had to delve into, I guess, what's called these days behavioral economics. Like, are you trying to? And that's one of the critiques of traditional economics, that it works fine in theory, but what about the practice? So is that part of what you're trying to do, just to anticipate what really drives human beings to make economic and political choices?
Well, I think the original book that we've been talking about was more traditional economics. And I've seen some of the limitations of that as these things have played out in practice. I think they've been super effective and powerful in the way that they've been used. And there are clear limits that are going to stop them from scaling broader without understanding all that stuff better. And the element that I think is most important is understanding community relationships. The original model was based very much on there's just all these individuals and they do their individual things, because that's the way that usual one person, one vote systems are set up. That's the way that capitalist markets are set up. The next generation of this stuff really is to take into account the fact that we have close relationships with people who are close to physically, or in governments or in families. And that's what we're working on right now.
What do you see then as the goal of the marketplace?
I mean, I view a marketplace as a way of expressing a set of values about how we all want to live together. It's a way of letting us empower people to shape their own futures. And the simplistic version of the marketplace thinks of people doing that as individuals. It just thinks every one of us just chooses what we want. But a more sophisticated version understands that we actually do it in social groups. We do it in relationship to each other. And those groups aren't usually a government, a nation. Sometimes they are, but often they're communities of various forms. And the goal of a well-functioning market should be to empower those communities to shape their own futures in the way that sort of federalism does, but taking into account the fact that it's not like the only community we have is our province. It might be our church or our local community or things like that.
Yeah, I see part of the goal here to push down authority and choice about how resources are allocated, which is what basically economics is, down to a more individualistic level. I'm going to have to ask whether that's a yes or no, because we're going to take another brief break. But am I on the right track there?
I don't think quite. I think it's more to communities.
Okay,
that's how I would think about it.
Okay. Well, we're going to have one more kick at the can here with another segment with our guest, Glen Weyl. Please stay with us. We'll be right back after these breaks. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Glen Weyl. He is the author of a book called Radical Markets, and he is the founder of RadicalxChange. Glen, tell us a little bit about your thoughts on digital monopolies and perhaps the antidote to them.
Yeah, so I work at Microsoft, and I'm very involved in the tech space. I'm a big believer in the power of digital platforms to offer lots of opportunities of technologies to do all sorts of things for us. And I think that power won't be fully unleashed until people are able to, in an open and interoperable way, make full use of all of those systems. Right now, a lot of that power is concentrated in the hands of the people who sort of scrambled to take control of those platforms. That wasn't the original intention in creating the internet. The original intention was that there would be these open protocols that would enable people to do all sorts of things. But the original open protocols really just let people put out speech, let them say things online. It didn't really empower them to do all the things you need to do to have a market economy. Didn't have digital payments. It didn't have identity systems. It didn't have ways of people keeping track of and securely transacting in data and computation. And because of those problems, all those other elements ended up being sort of taken over by these feudal lords who now control so much of the digital space. And I think what we fundamentally need is investment by universities and the public sector and other places to realize the true vision of cyberspace, which was one where all of those fundamental things that make markets possible in the real world are possible online.
So you see it through investing in alternative platforms or alternative technologies? How does it work?
Yeah, I want to see the foundations basically of fundamental human rights, rights of property, rights of commerce, rights of identity and personhood, like things like passports. I want those to be available in the digital space. Right now, they're only available in what we call meat space in the tech world. And without those fundamental human rights online, you have to go through Facebook or Google or Amazon just to do the most basic things you'd want to do in the world, or PayPal. We need to make those available as not even public services, but fundamental infrastructure that's available to everyone, independent of government or et cetera. And that is what they've done in Taiwan. Taiwan is the world's leader in creating a digital space that's actually achieving these goals. And it's been incredibly successful, both in its economy, its response to the pandemic, its response to misinformation. There's no reason why we can't do that more broadly.
Is this, how does this interplay with the metaverse?
Well, the metaverse is, it's a parallel reality, but it's going to be a parallel reality on the current trajectory where your whole life is going to be owned by a company town. Yeah. And nobody wants to live in that world. We want to live in a world of open commerce, which has to be enabled by having public streets that you can walk down and public markets where you can trade and public bridges so that you can bring your products to market. And those and passports so that you don't get stopped everywhere, and public security. We don't have any of those affordances in the digital world, and we desperately need public-private partnerships and international things to invest in making it possible to actually have like a decent liberal democratic society in the digital space. And instead, we just get people wanting to regulate things and slap down things, or people wanting to defend these monopolies. And we need a different agenda that actually proactively invests in creating the technologies we need to make that world possible.
We've got about 20 seconds left. Are cryptocurrencies part of the solution then as well?
At some level, in some ways, but I'd much rather see a concerted multi-sectoral effort than a bunch of sort of random anarchists out there throwing ideas that aren't half-baked, out into the world.
Well, it's going to be an interesting future. I want to thank our guest, Glen Weyl, for mapping out his version of it. A very, very interesting topic. I wish you well in the continued debate on these topics.
You too, Tony. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, as you can see, there's a lot of new ideas percolating about how to improve our capitalism and marketplaces and democracy. And we just heard a very interesting author who's got a lot of connections to Canada as well. And we'll be following this topic. I don't think it's going to go away anywhere. Thanks for watching today.